Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Facing the abyss, Ukraine is running out of options. As winter approaches with a crashing economy, the regime in Kiev has hinted it may be looking to end the civil war. But that train may have already left the station. To CrossTalk Ukraine's civil war, I'm joined by my guest, Joshua Tartakovsky in New York. He's an independent journalist. In Atlanta, we have Jim Dean. He is a managing editor and columnist for Veterans Today. And here in Moscow, we cross to Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with the Voice of Russia. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Joshua in New York, you wrote an article a few weeks ago that was amazingly moving, in my opinion, and it talked about perceptions of the civil war in Ukraine to the point where even the West doesn't even want to dare call it a civil war because there would be culpability involved. Please tell our viewers what the article was about and why you wrote it.
Well, my impression is that many intellectuals or liberal publications which focus on the war in Ukraine, first of all, they depict it as if it's a war between Ukraine and Russia, which is absolutely false. It's basically a situation in which the state, Ukraine, has turned against its own citizens. It is bombarding them with impunity in East Ukraine. Secondly, it depicts the impression we often get in the Western media and in the mainstream corporate media of the conflict in Ukraine is that the people in East Ukraine have nothing to do with the fighters who are fighting there. They're captured by these alien fighters who came in from outside, and they simply want to be free from the fact that they were taken over. They're not being bombarded heavily. We don't know about the numbers of refugees, although 90,000 people were already displaced internally, and over 200,000 people fled to Russia. They didn't flee to Kiev, they fled to Russia. We have no idea of the catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe which has taken place in East Ukraine. So at the same time, the people in East Ukraine are being demonized as mobs, lawlessness, chaos, irresponsible people who cannot be trusted and are constantly lying. And we also have an impression that Russia is constantly invading, which is absolutely false, as if Russia is this kind of Loch Ness monster, which is always erupting from somewhere. We never see it actually in front of us. It's just always emerging.
I like that, Joshua, the Loch Ness monster. Let me go to Dima here in Moscow. Yes, the Loch Ness monster. That's exactly what's happening. I'm looking at the Atlantic right now. Russia is already invading Ukraine by that well-known intellectual known as David Fromm at the Atlantic here. Russia's already invaded. Dima, did you know that?
Well, first I would like to say that I admire Joshua for his courage, because what he's saying is going against the mainstream in the West, and this is getting increasingly difficult to do now. I would just like to correct some figures. There are certainly more refugees. Even according to the United Nations data, there are currently 270,000 East Ukrainian refugees in Russia. The real figure is certainly bigger, because a lot of people did not register as refugees. They're just staying with their friends or relatives. It's no less than 700,000. And I think it's a realistic estimate, because Donetsk is a city with a population over 1 million. Lugansk is a city with a population approaching 1 million. And both of these cities in the last few weeks faced a humanitarian disaster. They were bombarded and they were lacking food and water. You remember that this Russian demonized convoy had to wait for 10 days before it could cross into Ukraine and bring food to these people. But Joshua is absolutely right. The Western media, it doesn't even notice how it contradicts what it had been saying just a few days ago. Before we discuss the invasion, let me remind you that a few weeks ago, the West declared Russia guilty of the Malaysian Airlines disaster, even before the evidence was collected. Not only before the trial, but before the evidence was collected. Now, for 3 weeks, the black boxes are in the hands of British experts, and we don't hear anything from them, Everyone seems to have forgotten in the same
Well,
way.
or
Believe me, they will forget
Dima, if I
that
could
Russia
jump in
invaded
here,
Ukraine.
or Dima, we all know what the outcome is. That's why they don't want to report it here. Jim, if I can go to you in Atlanta, I mean, there is a humanitarian crisis being played out in eastern Ukraine, but you would never understand that from Western media. So the suffering of people in the East, ethnic Russians in the East, is less worthy of coverage, I suppose, than the humanitarian crisis that the United States has created in Iraq.
Well, what we're seeing is really cruelty on really a massive scale here. And there's three parts to it. Veterans Today is primarily an intelligence website. And we have a lot of the older Cold War people with us. And what we're seeing here is about as top drawer a psychological operation being run that anything that's ever been designed before. And one of the classic tools is when you know you're going to be doing a lot of nasty things somewhere as part of an operation or taking over a country through destabilization, one of the first things you do is everything you're going to be doing, you start accusing the other side of doing it so that you can get the media on that first. And when they deny it, they already know from their testing that once they're on the defensive, the public always tends to believe the people that made the accusation. So we have, through NATO and the Pentagon, really what's going on is an offensive war, basically, that's economic. Two, the media stand down. We're just watching what the media is doing. And no offense to our Russian friends, but it's almost like we've swapped places with the old Pravda and the red Chinese newspapers that just printed whatever the government commissars told them to put out. I mean, they are printing the most unbelievable, unsubstantiated stuff. And even in case after case after case where the information is discredited within 24 hours, there's no revolt in the media to say, hey, you've got to stop. You got to stop giving us this totally bogus information. So
let me go to Joshua here. Let me go to Joshua in New York. It's an extremely good point here because, if you were a CEO of a company and you kept getting your predictions wrong and your estimations wrong, you would be fired by shareholders. But if you report on certain countries, particularly Russia, no matter how wrong you get it, you're still given a pat on the back and maybe a raise. Okay, you can always get Russia wrong and never be in trouble.
Exactly. I would say it reached quite frightening levels because what we have is that the Western media is constantly, almost day after day, blaming Russia for things it did not commit, and it fits into people's ready-made idea of Russians, of some people's negative stigmas of Russians as these barbarians or angry people, uncontrollable people who are out there to draw chaos, which is completely unsubstantiated. The people in Donetsk are under a heavy bombardment, so in Lugansk. Many civilians are getting killed intentionally by Ukrainian forces and extreme right-wing militias. And not only is the Western media extremely not even apologizing for or retracting unbased allegations, which it printed every day and which have no basis whatsoever, but they simply do not portray the facts that are taking place on the ground. When you have a battalion like the Azov battalion, which is composed of neo-Nazis and which had attracted neo-Nazis from throughout Europe and is sponsored by an oligarch, you would expect the New York Times to mention this at some point. They don't even bother to mention it. So there's no mention of actual extremist and ultra-right-wing military units which are bombarding civilians. But there is, New York Times yesterday was extremely concerned about the fact that perhaps, according to its own unbased allegations, Russian soldiers came in and now the Ukrainian soldiers are in retreat. And you can see how in the article they're extremely concerned about the fact that the Ukrainian soldiers are in retreat and the poor Ukrainian soldiers are suffering from the Russian soldiers.
Because Russia has invaded Ukraine. You just keep saying it over and over and over again, but it hasn't happened. Dima Babic, if I can go to you, again, every time the reference to Crimea is made after Russia invaded Crimea. And, I watched that on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, et cetera, and I would always like to, stop the frame and say, can someone please tell me the date of the invasion? And then, hit play, because you can't name a date because there was no invasion. This is what we're fighting against. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, the problem is that, indeed, not a single person was killed during this so-called invasion of Crimea. the Ukrainian troops stationed in Crimea did not want to protect it. They just left because the population was overwhelmingly for the union with Russia. But the problem is that when things don't go according to a plan, Russia is always to blame. It is quite clear that this parade in Kiev, which we saw on August the 24th, it was supposed to be the victory parade. Poroshenko expected to take Lugansk and Donetsk by that date. So instead of a victory parade, we had a very embarrassing situation because the rebels started a counteroffensive. And how do you explain it to the people? Okay, Russia invaded, because this is the only way you can save face in this situation. What is very interesting is that the Ukrainian authorities said they didn't have ballistic missiles. And the ballistic missiles were at this parade. So it was an embarrassment on the top of another embarrassment. But I would like to mention, I condemn Russophobia not because I am Russian. There are all kinds of racism in modern world. The problem with Russophobia is that you can explain by the evil designs of Russians any mistake that the Western governments make. In Syria, why are things not going according to a plan? Because Russia did not vote in the Security Council in favor of a resolution, in fact, pushing Assad from power. Why are things not going according to the plan in Ukraine? Why are the rebels counterattacking? Because Russia invaded. So Russia is always used as an excuse for Western governments' mistakes.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go back to Atlanta. Jim, I looked at very carefully at the summit in Minsk where the presidents of Russia and Ukraine met and looked at the transcript of the Q&A President Putin had later. He did it like at 2 o'clock in the morning. What's really quite interesting is that to really resolve the civil war in Ukraine is that everyone in Ukraine, all the major parties, have to sit down together and talk. First, to end the civil war, and then to start a new relationship with Russia, because let's be frank, Russia holds almost all of the cards. The Ukrainians want cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap products, cheap, and non-payment here. And at the same time, to echo what Dima Babic was saying, the demonization of Russians in the east of that country and Russia itself isn't doing any good. I don't know how we're going to make these two ends meet. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, it's like they have this crazy idea that they think that they can use that if you give us what we want, which is we want to have a trade arrangement with the EU, and yet we want all of the Russian subsidies to continue, we'll stop demonizing you. Like they think that's going to be what the deal's going to work out. But really, what these dummies are doing, and this is why the Western people are going to pay for this, because Ukraine is getting ready, is in the process of jumping off the cliff financially. It's already a basket case. And Putin put out the other day that I think it was going to be in 10 years, they are going to cancel all of their subsidies and preferential policies with Ukraine. And that was going to be $160 billion euros. Rough that out to 20 billion US. That's $20 billion a year losses to the economy. And hey, guess what? Ukraine doesn't have $20 billion a year to lose. So all of the money, the IMF loans and whatever, that's just going to turn into a tidal wave of red ink. And the IMF lady said early on in the game, and she was the only one that said this, that we're going to have to be very careful how this IMF loan money is used, which means it's just not frittered away.
Well, you got to remember it's Ukraine.
But, we're going to need this.
I'll tell you, corruption in Ukraine makes Russians blush, okay? Believe me. Joshua, let me go to you in New York. If you looked at some of the pictures taken at that summit, it was extremely interesting. You had the EU, you had Ukraine, you had Russia, you had the customs union, and you had also representatives of the association agreement with the European Union. It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, We had that option back in November. We had that option. Everybody was around the table and said, hey, maybe we can kind of work this out. You know, we can finesse this. We can give a little bit on that. We all can compromise. But no, Brussels said no, 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 3 times. And then what? And now let's go to the present. How many people have died? How many people are displaced? How many people have been injured? This economy is in tatters. And all of a sudden, I see Lady Ashton in Minsk. Remarkable.
Absolutely. It's just incredible because when President Putin in November offered Ukraine to have trilateral economic relations with the EU and Russia, the EU didn't want to hear about it. Now all of a sudden they're considering it. They're bringing it back on the table. And now also Angela Merkel suddenly remembered that there is a possibility of having a federation in Ukraine. After the ethnic Russians in Ukraine have come under a massive bombardment, after there's an incredible hate campaign against them, both by the media and among politicians, coming from politicians, incredible hate speech which would not be acceptable, and if Western audience would actually be aware of the degree of racism involved, I think they would be quite shocked. And many, I've heard stories from friends in Donetsk how many Ukrainian soldiers have told them, we came here because our government promised us that we're going to get your homes after we capture this area and we will subjugate you. You will be our slaves. And now after this, Angela Merkel decided that federation is a good idea.
Okay, you know,
So,
hey, let me go.
besides
We're
blaming
rapidly
Russia for
running out of
everything-
time here, Joshua. I want to go to Dima here in Moscow. Dima, is it possible now? Can we put the horse back into the yard there? Because so much has happened right now. I mean, logically speaking, what Joshua said, you know, this is the way it should be: federalizing Ukraine. Okay, having some kind of trilateral trade agreement, which perfect sense, you know. But you know, Victoria Nuland wanted everything. It wanted Ukraine. It wanted NATO expansion. It wants everything maximalist all the time. Can we go back to November? Can we pretend somehow and go back and see if that can work?
Well, we can always do better than we do now because what has been going on until now was just unacceptable. And I completely agree with Joshua that when Yanukovych, it was initially Yanukovych who suggested trilateral negotiations in November last year, if it had been accepted by the EU, Putin accepted it, things would have been totally different right now. And I agree with Jim that the biggest costs are for the Western community of nations, because remember, Yanukovych did not cancel this association agreement with the EU. He just postponed it. And he said that it would cost Ukraine 160 billion euros. In fact, of course, he would be satisfied with a smaller compensation. But the EU didn't give him a single penny. The result was that now the EU has already paid much more than Yanukovych has been demanding because of the war and because of the coup in Kiev. The EU simply has no plan for Ukraine because Ukraine severed all economic ties to Russia under pressure from the EU. It cancelled its contract with Gazprom. And the question is, who is going to heat and feed Ukraine this winter? The outstanding debt of the Naftogaz, you know, the Ukrainian energy company, to Gazprom is $5 billion. Who is going to pay this amount? Ukraine is not ready to pay it. So the problem is that sooner or later, the EU and the United States will carry much bigger losses than the ones, you know, the compensation that Yanukovych asked them to provide 1 year ago.
It's very interesting. Dima, let me go to Jim here, because everything you said is factually true, absolutely spot on. But you know what, Jim? When everything goes south, it's just going to be Russia's fault, just like it is. Nuland got this right. She got this right, because either you get all of it or you wreck it all. And, you know, and what it does is it sours relations between the European Union and Russia. And this is exactly what that U.S. State Department wants.
Well, this is something that we've been editorializing about at Veterans Today. And personally, I've been savaging. We've got to savage the horrendous quality of Western media leadership. That's the U.S. and Europe. Because this whole thing from the beginning, whoever thought it up, made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And we're facing a situation now that if we don't extract a terrible political price for the mistakes that have been done here, we're just leaving them open to come back at us again. Because what's going on here, the misleadership here, the disasters that are being manufactured and planned have actually now become the worst national security risk that Americans and Europeans and plus everybody else faces. So we now have our governments doing things that are so dangerous that they're inflicting damage on us that typically would be inflicted, after you had a war and lost the war. And yet the media, none of the institutions are going after them. There should be riots in the street to extract the punishment from these people that
Jim,
did this.
let me go to Joshua, because that's exactly it. Let's think of the apple growers in Poland and, I don't know, the grapefruit growers in Portugal. A year ago, everything was just going fine, and all of a sudden, our businesses have collapsed. Over what? Ukraine? What? I mean, this has got to be the reaction here. And I think the cooler heads in Europe are going to be able to realize is that, why is it worth it? Victoria Nuland's wet dream? I mean, is it really worth it to the West to have such a bad relationship with a country that has expressed zero aggression towards anyone? Russia is a contracting status quo power, if you know anything about the post-Soviet history. Go ahead, Joshua.
Yes, I would agree exactly with what Dima and Jim say, because I think we reached a point where Angela Merkel realized that if she faces massive unemployment because of the sanctions and the situation is deteriorating, so many lives are lost, and in addition to that, we're moving beyond any kind of solution. What kind of solution is this to attack civilians? It's pretty clear that she's going to have to think of that this didn't make sense. This was a wrong bet, and it didn't bring us any good solutions at all. Of course, it's always easy to blame Russia. Just recall that the United States also blamed Russia for interfering in for not interfering in the referendum in Lugansk and Donetsk. So the U.S. was saying that they should have stopped that. So in short, everything is Russia's fault, but that's completely irrational. And I think Angela Merkel knows better than that. She knows. I think she's a bit smarter than Victoria Nuland.
Yeah, I think so. She's proven it here.
Yes.
Dima, it's very interesting is that Russia gets blamed for doing something or not doing enough. It's quite remarkable. It's a no-win situation.
I still hope for the better, but I would again say about Mrs. Merkel that I would not put too much hope on her, because it was interesting. She said she wanted, I quote, some measures that wouldn't hurt Russia. Wasn't it her who just 3 weeks ago initiated the EU sanctions against Russia, which led to cessation of food imports from the European Union? So, unfortunately, Mrs. Merkel has missed her opportunity to become a real savior of Europe in this situation. What is going on now is just absolutely terrible, because we hear for the first time since the beginning of the crisis, not only from the Ukrainian media, but also from the British and the American media, that Russia has invaded. The only factual basis is that 9 Russian soldiers were arrested by the Ukrainian security service on the border between Russia and Ukraine. That's a very strange invasion. You invade a country of 45 million people with 9 soldiers. But still, with the Western media, you can believe anything. They show you.
Okay, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests in New York, Atlanta, and here in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.